lot of effort went into making sure that Lilo and Stitch was as accurate to Hawaiian culture as possible. The creator of the character, Chris Sanders, originally came up with the idea of Stitch in 1985, and he was going to put it into a storybook for kids. But he realized pretty quickly that it was a really long story and it wasn't going to fit into just a teeny tiny character book. And so in 1987, he was hired to work at Disney, where he worked all throughout the Disney Renaissance, even being promoted to head of story for the movie Mulan. After Mulan, while at a company retreat, he was asked if he wanted to adapt any of his stories into an original work, which of course he pitched the idea of Stitch. In the original pitch of the story, he was going to have Stitch crash land in a very remote forest and interact entirely with woodland creatures, and would have had little to no involvement with humans in the story. Eventually in this draft, he would have ended up at a farm in Kansas and would have been completely ostracized by all of the creatures. He was of course asked to revise this idea, where he used it later in a movie called The Wild Robot. After that, for the next 3 days, Sanders was holed up in his hotel room trying to come up with a story, and in this original concept, he had a little boy as the main character, but decided against it because he already had Stitch, who was a boy, and he thought a girl would help balance things out. He had recently been on a trip to Hawaii, and he had a brilliant idea. Why don't we set it in Hawaii? It's relatively remote. And so he sent off that idea to the heads, and it got approved almost immediately, but on one condition, that it looks like he drew it himself with his unique art style. But one thing that really set the production of Lilo and Stitch apart is that the relatively small production team was pretty much completely left alone by executives. They were only bothered when it went into full production. In the initial draft of the script, another thing that was majorly different was that the role of Jumba and Stitch were going to be completely different. So in the initial version, Stitch was going to be the head of an intergalactic gang, and Jumba was going to be one of his cronies who was asked to go and capture him. But early test audiences did not like that story, and so they changed it to be the role of creator and creation. Now, how did they make it as accurate to Hawaiian culture as they possibly could? Well, the entire animation team went and visited Kauai and had a tour guide who explained the entire concept of ohana to them, and that really helped develop even more of the film script. But after visiting Kauai, the animators realized they had another problem on the horizon, and that was they needed to take the realistic lives of all of these Hawaiians who were going through a very difficult time due to a recession and were living in a lot of impoverished areas because of this, and mesh it into something beautiful that people would still enjoy. So they wanted to make sure it was beautiful, but they wanted to accurately reflect the locale. And so to do that, part of the thing they did was to bring in experts who actually lived on the island. Not only that, they hired Tia Carrere, who was a local of Honolulu, and Jason Scott Lee, who was born and raised in Hawaii, to help do their characters' dialogue, making sure that they were able to use accurate slang, make sure that it was all correct, and even it helped to make it more authentic. Another thing the animators decided to focus when it came to the story was making it about two sisters, which at the time was incredibly rare in American media. Disney, though, would of course go on to use this formula multiple times in later movies. Next up, we have our animation style, and that's going to be completely different. If you notice, Lilo and Stitch doesn't look anything like any other animated movies that Disney did at the time, and that's for a good reason. That's because they used watercolor, which was something that Disney had done previously but had discontinued in the 1940s. And do you remember how I said the entire movie needed to look like it was in Chris Sanders' art style? Well, that worked in a couple of ways. For one thing, the budget was teeny tiny, so they couldn't afford to do any sort of computer-generated imagery, and they couldn't afford to do anything fancy with it. And so a little handbook was created and distributed to the animators by the film's visual lead, and it was called Surfing the Sanders Style, and it was to help them figure out how to draw exactly like Chris Sanders. Also, remember how I said the movie had a teeny tiny budget for a Disney film? Yeah, it was so small they couldn't even afford to draw fancy designs or pockets on any of the characters, so all of their clothing is really simple. In addition, to help save more on budget, they tried to make sure they didn't have to do any sort of complex shadows, so most of the scenes take place in very shady areas, and as well as indoor locations, just to avoid the use of shadows. But they made sure to spend where it really mattered. For one thing, they made sure to base all of the extraterrestrial elements on marine life, so they did study that. But that tiny budget was almost completely ruined after the 9/11 attacks. For those who don't know, Stitch was originally supposed to be flying a Boeing 747 throughout the streets of Honolulu and narrowly avoiding multiple buildings, and they had an issue. They needed to change all of that. And so with only a few weeks left in production, they managed to rework the entire scene, make it so it looks like they were flying through the mountains of Kauai on a spaceship. But this derailed the original ending they had planned as well, and so they had to reduce it to just a 2-minute clip with a little montage of them showing their happily ever after. And casting for the film was no easy feat as well. DeVay Chase, who voices Lilo, you may know her from The Ring as well, but she was one of 150 little girls who auditioned for the role. Even more interesting though was Stitch was originally supposed to be a completely nonverbal character, but they decided to go ahead and have Chris Sanders, the creator and director, voice him instead. Apparently, he used to use the Stitch voice to prank call people throughout the office, and they all thought this was a hysterical idea and urged him to do it. The next most interesting one is Cobra Bubbles, who originally was envisioned as a completely different character. They even had Jeff Goldblum in mind to do the role. But Goldblum ultimately declined the role, and so they decided to go ahead and rework the character with envisioning Ving Rhames, who was offered the role and accepted it. And so the movie is pretty much complete, and now we need to market the film. And they did actually do a very large marketing campaign. He had a brilliant idea. What if Stitch invaded other Disney properties? And they called these little pieces interstitials. Most of these properties Chris Sanders himself had previously worked on, such as The Little Mermaid, Aladdin, and so they had Stitch do these little segments where he would invade the films, and it was incredibly popular and worked out well for marketing. Fun fact, they even got all of the original cast members from those movies to reprise their roles, with many of them citing being very uncomfortable with how rude they were being to the characters, saying it wouldn't fit their own characters. Despite this, Lilo and Stitch never came in first place at the box office. It actually did relatively poorly for a Disney movie. Because it fell cursed to what a lot of animated films were going through at that time, being lined up against a bunch of heavy hitters. During its run, it went up against Spider-Man, Star Wars Episode 2, Men in Black, and Minority Report. So the fact that it came in second and third throughout most of the weeks was impressive in and of itself. It even went against the live-action Scooby-Doo and The Bourne Identity. But it held out fairly strong consistently for several weeks, making a total of $273 million worldwide. But here's the thing, it had incredibly strong DVD sales, incredibly strong merch sales, and was really beloved by the general population and critics. So much so that they went on to make a TV series, multiple sequels, an anime, and a Chinese adaptation as well. And then of course, more recently, the live-action Lilo and Stitch came out, which I do want people to know that Chris Sanders had no involvement in besides voicing the character of Stitch. That movie went on to make a ton of money, more than the animated film ever did, to be honest with you, but I still prefer the animated version by a lot.